Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, Moving Lights, the Art of Perfect Positioning with Brad Schiller. My name is Lane Shannon and I'm a Content Marketing Manager here at Harman. Just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels. However, there is a Q&A function where you can submit questions to the presenter and they will try to answer as many as possible at the end. The webinar is also being recorded and the link will be made available a few days after the presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control, and we encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional Training to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are always available to you free of charge. And now I'd like to introduce you to the presenter for today's webinar. Brad Schiller's career in automated lighting spans 30 years. He is a business development manager at Martin and the author of both Living the Lighting Life and the Automated Lighting Programmer's Handbook, as well as a columnist for PLSN. A self-described lighting geek, Brad enjoys sharing knowledge with others. And now I'll pass it over to you, Brad.
Thank you, Lane. And thank you everyone for joining today, whether you're here live, which I appreciate, or you're watching this later on the YouTube version. Either way, I'm glad you're here. And we're going to be talking about the art of perfect positioning. Well, I'm going to be talking about it. You're going to be listening. Shouldn't say we. At any rate, so let's move right along. With moving lights, they were created to move. And so, of course, that's the basic thing that we do. We actually want to move lights. And the most basic thing for any programmer when you sit down is to figure out how to make a moving light move from point A to point B. And you might think, well, that's pretty basic, but there's a lot actually involved in that. There's a lot more than just how to make a light move from A to B. There's a lot of things you can do to perfect your positioning. And what's interesting too is if you're using moving lights on every single show, you're going to have to move those lights. Even if it's some event where you're just setting them to one look and leave it, you still have to initially make that one look. So no matter what production you're doing with moving lights, you're going to have to move those lights. Okay, well, maybe if you're only going to point them straight down, you would never have to move them, but then why would you have moving lights? So every moving light, you would want to figure out and learn how to move it. Interestingly enough, though, initially when moving lights were first created, they weren't created to be seen moving. They were just created to be positionable moving fixtures that could change positions in between different scenes or different acts. And it wasn't until later on when the company Verilight created some moving lights that they again intended just to move from song to song, that they accidentally moved them all at once and went, whoa, that's awesome. And they decided to make that something exciting of moving lights and seeing the lights move on their own. If you want to know more about moving light history, there's a webinar that myself and Craig Rutherford presented called The History and Evolution of Automated Lighting. And you can find that on the YouTube channel with all the learning sessions. And in that, we go through a lot of the history of moving lights, and you can understand all the different types of fixtures have been created, from moving mirrors to yokes to some other things that are out there. And you can learn the history. So check that out when you have some time. It's pretty interesting. Today, though, I've broken this session down to 3 areas. The first is preparing to position. We're going to talk about things you need to prepare in your console and the fixtures to get ready. Then we're going to actually talk about how to position. And finally, I'm going to speak about common positions that are you might find useful for any type of production. Again, as Lane said, you can ask questions. You can use the Q&A button on Zoom there. Just click on that, type in your question at any time. And then at the very end of the session, once I finish, Lane will read those questions back and I'll be happy to answer them. It's always fun to get lots of good questions. All right, so let's jump right in. Part 1 here, we're going to talk about planning for perfection. Again, getting everything organized and ready for you to actually start making your positions. So the first thing I want to talk about is the hardware. You on your console, most consoles have encoders, and we'll talk about different types of hardware a little later. But initially, one of the things you might want to configure is the layout of where pan and tilt fall on your encoders. Some consoles are like the one you see here, where they're laid out in a vertical orientation. Others are more horizontal. And you can typically go in and define where you want your pan and tilt to lie. That's oftentimes called a wheel set. So you can go into your console configuration, depending on the type of console, And you could define, I want the pan and tilt to be at the top of this row of 4 that you see on the screen. Or you could put it at the bottom, or perhaps you want it to be to the left or to the right of a group of encoders. Again, it's the choice of what's most comfortable for you. A lot of times people will like to do that and put those different encoders where it's closer to the next and previous button, so that your hand doesn't have to move away too far. If you're panning and tilting, you can just reach over with a pinky or with another finger and hit next or previous to advance to subsequent fixtures. Now, sometimes that's not possible. Maybe the buttons are in odd places on your console, but there might be user keys or macros that you can go in and define for previous and next fixture. And in that case, it's very useful to place those somewhere nearby your encoders so that, again, you have quick access to hit previous and next. So it's very helpful before you start positioning to configure the console and go in and set up your encoders and your wheel sets. Now, there are some other consoles, such as the EOS TI, that actually allow you to dedicate encoders to a specific function. So you can dedicate encoders to be pan and tilt all the time. So no matter what mode you're in, no matter what's happening on the console, you know you can reach up to those encoders and turn them and they will be pan and tilt. Very, very useful things you can do. Another thing that I like to do is I like to think about the default position setting in my console. Most every console sets fixtures to default at 50-50. And in typical hanging situations, that means they're pointing straight down, or if they're floor fixtures, they're pointing straight up. And while that's useful to give you a starting point to program from, the thing is that can get confusing, particularly with yoke type fixtures, because you might create your positions coming from different directions with the moving lights. So what I like to do is I find a default position that is actually more of a downstage. I tilt my lights to the downstage edge. Now, whenever that's the default position, so now whenever I grab a fixture and nothing's playing, it's already pointing downstage. Now I can just pan it, tilt it, kind of move them all in the same orientation as a starting point. However, if they were pointing straight down, I might grab a light and move it the wrong way around, which will result in flips, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is undesirable. So it can be very useful to have a default position. You do need to be careful, I'll warn you, however, to when you modify that default position in your console, because what can happen is you could turn everything off to release or off everything on your console, and let's say you shut down the rig, the fixtures will still be pointing in this default position, not go back to their default 50-50 that most people are used to. And that can throw off your technicians or others who look up in the rig and say, oh, everything's pointing still. You must have left your console on, or other situations. So just be aware of that. But again, a default position can be very handy to go in and change those settings from 50-50 to something that's more desirable. The next thing to consider is the pan and tilt settings. I prefer to know the way the encoder is going to work with my fixtures, so that if I'm working on pan and I turn my encoder to my right or clockwise, that the fixtures from my perspective sitting at the console will move to my right. And if I turn the encoder to the left or counterclockwise, the fixtures will move to my left. And that's very useful because if I grab a fixture and I'm looking at it, I can turn that wheel to the right and it will move to my right. And it's important to set that for all of your fixtures. And it's very common that fixtures are placed in different orientations, and that will result in a different type of movement from fixture type to fixture type, or fixture location to location. And most consoles let you go in and adjust that. So for example, here in this rig, you see I have some fixtures in the air that are kind of a lavender, and some fixtures on the floor that are in a bluish color or cyan. If I didn't configure them, what would happen is I would go and turn and they would go opposite directions. But as again, you can quickly go into your configuration of your console, and usually you can set some sort of pan or tilt invert. And as you do that per fixtures, I do that for the floor fixtures, now they all move together as I turn that encoder wheel. Very, very useful, because you want to know when you grab any light and you turn that encoder that it's going to move the direction that you intend it to move. What you don't want is to have your entire rig have all different types of directions, to where when you grab fixture 101, you turn to the right, it moves to your right. You grab fixture 204 and you turn to the right, but it moves to the left. You want that consistency. Consistency is very, very important when programming. You want everything to be aligned. So it's important to set those configurations early before you begin programming. Now, when you do go set pan and tilt settings, some consoles give you various options even further. They allow you to choose whether you want to invert the pan and tilt via DMX inverting or via encoder encoding. And it's very important that you understand the difference. If you invert it from DMX, then it'll actually take and invert the DMX values that are stored in your queues. And that could have an effect if you already have a programmed show, or if you're walking into a venue that's already got positions made. If you do that, then things are going to change quite drastically. In that case, you'd want to use an encoder invert, where the console is actually just changing the way the encoder is driven, but what's happening is that the DMX values are staying the same to the fixtures. It's a personal choice which one you want, but it also makes a big difference if things are already programmed to choose the option that works better. All right, so once you've done that and the rig is built, before you even sit down to start building positions, there's a few things you need to take into consideration. The first one is make sure your fixtures have been calibrated, reset, or homed. Those are all different terms that basically mean that you can hit the send the fixture a command and it'll reset its pan and tilt back to its normal methods. Because if a fixture is hit or bumped, it might be knocked into something that's not correct. And if you go and update all your positions and the fixture is out of calibration, guess what? Once the rig is powered down and back up, or you send a reset command, all your positioning will be off. So it's a very good habit before you sit down to build your positions to reset the fixtures or send them a calibrate or home command. That way you'll know they're all starting from their own mechanical defaults. Very useful. Another thing, check to make sure the rig is actually at the trim height. Now, trim height is the height from the stage where the fixtures will be positioned. They could be on a truss, they could be on a batten in a theater, they could be on a crank-up system. There's all different ways that fixtures can be placed at a height. And you want to make sure that the rig is actually at the true trim height that it will be for the show before you start building your positions. Because once again, if it's not at the trim height, if it's a foot lower, you build all your positions, then they take the truss to trim height, guess what? You've got to go back and re-update them. So it's always important to ensure that the rig is at proper trim height prior to setting up and building your positions. I mentioned setting pan and tilt inverts on your console, and that's very useful. Fixtures also have that ability, and that ability can often be set through the menu system or through RDM, and sometimes even from DMX settings. And my advice is do not use the pan and tilt swap options or invert options that are directly in the fixture. It's much easier just to recommend or ask your crew to set all fixtures to those options to off. Then you could take care of those pan and tilt inverts directly from the console, because you might want it different than the way that somebody thinks of the fixture, or more importantly, if a fixture has a problem and has to be swapped out and somebody changes that fixture, they don't know that fixture number 404 needed to have the pan invert enabled. So they might put it back up there and now it's going to move completely the wrong way. It's better to just always have those options turned off from the fixtures and set them directly from your console. Another thing to be aware of, some fixtures in the market have different speed modes that again can be set through the menu system or through RDM or even from DMX. And these speed modes will adjust how fast or slow the pan and tilt movement reacts to DMX. And this happens for different reasons. Some manufacturers will default the fixtures to a speed that is very nice and smooth and comfortable and not too noisy, but they might have a fast mode that allows the fixture to move even faster, but maybe it's a little noisier. Or perhaps they have a mode that you could put the fixture in to enable it to move even slower and smoother. Well, you want to make sure all your fixtures are set to the same mode. Typically, you might ask for them to be defaulted all to off, unless you know you're going to want it to be super fast or super slow. But again, sometimes what happens is a fixture or two might come from the shop and might have come from a previous show and missed part of the QC and might be set to a different speed mode than all the rest. And you want to catch that early before you begin programming. Otherwise, once you start seeing your show playback, you might be stumped why a fixture is moving differently. For example, it might look like this. If you grab all your fixtures and tilt them, and then you see one kind of lag behind. Well, that one that lagged behind was probably due to being in a different speed mode. So what I'll do is I'll grab all my fixtures and I'll tilt them one way, and then I'll pan them one way and pan them the other, and I'll look for stragglers or look for one that gets there real fast before all the others. So it's useful to be aware of that, again, before you begin positioning. Now there's a big key to positions and lighting and consoles and all that, and that is something we call palettes or presets. Depending on what type of console you have, it might be called palettes, it might be called presets. And these are references. These are places you store data as a reference. It is very important that you make use of position, palettes, and presets in all of your programming. Now, if you're not familiar with what a palette or preset is, again, it is a reference, and it's very useful because normally if you just store pan and tilt, let's say I move my fixtures to a down center stage position, that might be a DMX value of 227 for tilt and, I don't know, 58 for pan, and you would store that into your queue. Well, later on, your queue is just going to have that data, and if that was the down center stage position, and now people are going to change where down center stage is, or your truss height changes, you're going to have to update that in all your queues, and that's a lot of work. Instead, you can use a palette or a preset to store that. You can label it down center stage, and now you store into all of your queues that palette reference. So instead of storing the raw value of DMX values or percentages, you're actually going to store in there that the fixture is at down center stage. Anytime that that cue is played or any other cue is played that references that, it'll look back to the values that are stored directly in that palette or preset. Very, very useful for a lot of conditions. It also gives you an opportunity to just have things pre-made. So if I want to focus all my lights on the drums, I can focus them there. Then anytime I want to put fixtures at the drums, I just have to select a fixture and press the drum button, and the fixtures will move there. I don't have to repeatedly keep moving my fixtures to the drums every time I want to have the fixtures be at the drum place. So even if you think you don't need to use the reference ability, it's still very important to build position, palettes, or presets just so you don't have to repeat remaking and moving fixtures to the same location over and over and over. Now, one more thing on palettes or presets. I said you should use them for every single show, and I totally agree and ask that you do that. I've said that for years, and I know some people who say, oh, no, it's just a one-off. I'll just use hard values. It'll be okay. So many years ago, I decided to try an experiment. I was asked to help a friend on a small little production that was a little award show thing. We had a small number of fixtures, and I said, I'm going to try an experiment here. I'm going to do what people have told me they do sometimes, and I'm not going to use any palettes or presets at all for my positioning. Well, it was a mess, as I expected it would be. Even though I knew it was going to be in one location and pretty simple, guess what? Somebody bumped a fixture and they fell over. They had to pick it up. Now everything was off. Somebody decided to move the podium. Everything was different. So even though it was a one-off production, it was still would have been much easier if I had used position palettes or presets. Helps tremendously. So please, I ask you on every single show to always make use of palettes or presets. Very, very important for your positions. You can use them for other things too, but positions especially. Now, palettes and presets also give you pre-programming abilities. If you're using a visualizer or even not using a visualizer, let's say you're just setting up your show file. I do this all the time. I'll prepare a show file at home and I'll make my different layouts. I'll go in and set my configuration. I'll set up my screens, do all these things to get ready for a show. I'll also build all the palettes and presets that I think I might need for that show. So if I'm doing, let's say, a rock band, I know there's going to be a guitar, there's going to be a singer, there's going to be a bass, there's going to be drums, there's going to be certain fly-out positions and audience, all these positions that I know I'm going to need. I can go ahead and build those palettes and presets even if I don't have a visualizer or have a rig. I can sit with my offline editor and store them all with a 50-50 position. They don't have to be in the true position. I'm just storing and giving them a label and calling it drummer or guitar or whatever. They're all equal at 50-50. I can then even go in and start building some cues. I can put in the rough draft, if you will, for some cues. So I could say, this is the first song they're going to play, and I know I need these 2 lights on the drummer and these 4 lights on the guitarist and these 6 on the lead singer. And even though when I'm doing that at home, they're all hitting 50-50, the minute that I get on site, I just have to update those palettes or presets, and wow, all my cues that I pre-built are ready to go. They're now updated in the right position. So palettes and presets can help you with some pre-programming as well. Additionally, on some consoles, you can store more than one attribute in your palettes and presets. So if you have a position palette that normally would have just pan and tilt, you could also store in framing shutters or zoom values or anything else that you find important. And this can be very useful. Let's say you're doing a theatrical production and you have a place where you want to hit a window. So you have a position for the window, and then you have framing shutters to frame in the window as well. You want to maybe store those together because you know you're always going to recall those together when you're going to update those together as well. You're never going to use them separately. So you might be able to store in or mask in or use an all type palette. Depends on your console. There's different ways you could store this other information of zoom and framing shutters along with the position. Now, anytime you select your fixtures and hit that palette or preset, it's going to not only move there, but it's going to go to the shape and size that you've predetermined. So that can be very useful. But I will warn you, it also can be very dangerous, because now if the LD says, oh, move a light up to that window position, I want to do a big spotlight around it, the minute you hit that, guess what's going to happen? It's going to go to the framing shutters. So just be careful. There's times you might want to have one palette for the position and another one for the framing shutters, and other times you might want to combine those into one for simplicity. Another cool feature on a lot of consoles is called embedded palettes or presets. And this is where one preset or palette can actually have others contained within it. So where I said that palettes and presets are references to data, you can make a special one that's embedded that references other reference palettes. So for example, again, with a band, if I know I have the guitar, the drums, the lead singer, and the bass, those 4 positions, and then I want to do a stage wash, instead of building a separate stage wash that lights them all up, I could just build it and select certain fixtures to be in the drum palettes, and other fixtures to be in the guitar, and another's in the lead singer, and another in the bass player, set all those up, and then store that as an embedded palette that I call stage wash. Now, anytime I use the stage wash, instead of referencing values for pan and tilt, it's referencing those other pre-made position palettes. And that helps you gain more palettes that don't need to be updated because they're already consisting of pre-made other ones. So very, very useful. I do suggest that you always label clearly your palettes and presets, your position palettes and presets. On most every console now, you can go in and type in a name. You want something descriptive, downstage center, guitar, chair special for act 1, scene 2, whatever it is that works for you in your production. It's very important that you label that, not only so you can go back and know what that palette or preset is, but also that data gets inserted into all of your cues. So if I label something for down center stage, now I can see that value in my cue data. So if I'm looking ahead and the LD says, oh, in the next cue, what is fixture 27 doing? I can glance at it, and instead of it saying pan and tilt is a value of 28/47, I can now see it says down center stage. That gives me lots of great information to know what's happening with that show. It also helps anybody else who might be taking over running the show or editing the show, or if you have to come back to it a year later, very important. Additionally, most consoles allow you to color code your palettes and presets. So as you can see in that one picture in the middle, you can color code them and set that certain ones are one color for what's on the stage, another color for beams that are out in the audience, maybe another color for specials. Very useful to help you quickly know and understand which positions are for what area of the venue. And then lastly, what we're seeing now is consoles are allowing you to add images or scribbles to your palettes and preset labeling. So now not only can you have a word description, but you can do a little drawing, as you see there with the beams and things, and that's from the Avalite desk, that picture there. But now other consoles are doing that as well. Very, very useful and interesting. And again, I urge you to be consistent on your palettes and presets, consistent in your labeling and consistent in your layout and color coding as well. Because as you move from show to show, if one day you call it down center stage and the next day you call it center stage down, or you put it in a different position area, you start with your positions that are in the audience and then the ones on the stage versus the other way around, then you're going to be struggling from show to show to find your different positions. If you can be consistent in your programming and laying out your positions and naming them, then it'll just be much easier for you as you move from show to show to show. I'm going to refer to another previous session that we had here at Martin Learning, the learning sessions. We had the Programming Essentials, Workflows, and Views from my friend Benny Kirkham. And Benny Kirkham talked about a lot of great things in that session. But one of the things he shared with us was he shared position count of various shows that he's done. Because a lot of times people ask, well, how many positions should I have in a show? And that's going to depend on the show. Certain shows, theatrical productions, are going to have a lot more positions than, say, a concert where more people are just a few people are on stage versus a large theatrical show. So it's going to vary. Also, you need to always consider when building positions how much time it's going to take for somebody to update those and maintain those. With a touring type show, those are always going to have to be updated at every stop of the tour. So if somebody has to update a whole bunch of position palettes, they may or may not have much time after the rig is built and before doors to go in and update those position palettes for that new venue and the new trim height. So you need to consider that as well. Now, what Benny shared was pretty interesting. He shared this chart here, and I stole it, and thank you, Benny. And when you see this someday, know that I made use of this wonderful information. And what he shared here was that he found that on his corporate shows were the least amount of positions that he used. Then things like Dancing with the Stars tour and M&M and Rihanna tour, which was two different bands together, he used quite a lot. And then he moved up through some Cirque shows and some other things. Cher the Musical was a Broadway show, and you see the number of positions increases. Well, it's easy on a permanent show like the MJ1 or Cher the Musical, because that's not moving around a whole lot. Lights aren't being changed around a lot. People can go in and update one or two positions as needed. So if there's 1,000 positions, it's not a huge task. Nobody's updating them all at once. But if you're on tour, let's say that tour with 180 positions, well, again, the lighting director might only have an hour to update those, and how he's going to manage updating 180 positions of maybe 200, 300, 400 fixtures. That always needs to be considered. All right, so one more thing on getting ready to position, we're still talking about getting ready, is understanding your fixtures. All fixtures move in different ways. There's mirrored fixtures, of course, there's yoke type fixtures, and they all have a predefined pan and tilt range. Commonly nowadays, most yoke type fixtures have a pan range of about 540 degrees and tilt of about 270. Not all of them have that, they're vary a little. In the olden days, they had a much less pan or tilt range, or mainly pan range, and it would be very common as you're moving around the stage that you would run to what we called an end stop, that you would try to pan it right and it would hit the stop and you wouldn't be able to make it anymore. And so then you would have to flip the light around to the other side of its pan and give it more room. And that was problematic. Luckily now, most fixtures have a pretty good pan range that allows you to move a wide range and cover your stage. Now, there are some fixtures that have continuous rotation abilities, but typically due to the way we control lights, that's more of a special feature that you enable that allows it to spin at different speeds than giving you true continuous rotation. Because remember, we're controlling these lights with values of DMX, so it's very hard to get that full rotation out of it. At any rate, typically you're okay with the normal pan and tilt ranges of the fixtures. Now, one of the things that is important to understand that because you have 540 degrees of movement, that means there's multiple ways to get to the same spot on stage. So if I put my fixture on down center stage, that's a certain pan and tilt value. But I could go to a different pan value and pull the tilt around the opposite direction, and guess what's going to happen? The light's pointing at the same place on stage, but it has a different pan and tilt value. And sometimes that's useful, but sometimes that is very undesirable. And you want to make sure that in general, as you're building positions, that your fixtures are on the same side of their pan and tilt so that you're not seeing a flip. Now I keep talking about a flip. What is a flip? Let's say you have this fixture here pointing over at stage right, and you want to just see it pan across the stage to the other side. And you see this happen. You see it do that little flip partway through. Well, that means that your two positions are not on the same side of the pan or tilt. So that's what's happened. You built your fixtures in the wrong area. Now, I mentioned earlier about using that default position of tilting your lights slightly downstage. That's very helpful when you build your positions because now you can just move them each way and they will avoid that flip. You can move them right or left. However, if you started from straight down and you pan first and then tilt, you're going to get it in all kinds of weird places. So we always want to try to avoid the flip. There are some times that a flip can be a really cool effect and you might want to use it. And most consoles have a flip button or feature. They used to be really important, but they've kind of gone into the background now that we have a larger pan range on our fixtures. All right, so that was getting ready. Now let's actually talk about how to position, getting into creating those positions and making it happen. I just alluded to this part here. Back in the very early days of Verilight, this is the first ever Verilight console, they developed what I call the first rule of positioning. And this is very important to follow all the time when you can, is always tilt first. If you can get in that habit as a programmer of always tilting first, then adjusting pan, you're going to find yourself in a much better place. Because otherwise, if you start panning, you might move that fixture around to a place that once you tilt it, you're going to tilt it the opposite way, and you're going to get really messed up on where you're at, which side of that fixture, and you're going to suddenly, as you move the light around your stage, find that you're going to have some flips happening. Now, if you get in the habit of always grabbing that tilt wheel first and tilting the light and then panning it, it's going to be much, much cleaner. Of course, if you just need to move the light and pan it to the right and you can grab the pan, of course you can do that. But try to be in the habit of always tilting first. Next thing is you need to understand resolution. Fixtures, almost all fixtures that are out there now use 16-bit positioning. Do you know what 16-bit positioning is? I do. I'm going to tell you. Hey, what do you know? So it's really important you understand this because DMX is set up on a 256-step system. We have values that go from 0 to 255 for every parameter of a moving light. And that's what you're adjusting when you change that. But quickly, we found out as manufacturers that that was not enough resolution to move a light. Let's say you're moving a light across 30 feet across a stage or 50 feet across a stage, 256 steps just didn't make for nice, smooth movement. So we had to create a way to give you more steps to control. So what they did is they combined two DMX channels together to multiply 256 times 256 to give us 65,536 steps or 16-bit resolution. So now you go from 0 to 65,535 on your DMX values. Now, the way this actually works is you have two channels. One channel is called the coarse channel, and the other channel is called the fine channel. And what that does is the coarse channel still operates and moves the light in the big chunks from 0 to 255 across your stage. However, each of those big chunks is broken up on the fine channel into 256 individual steps in between there. So now, not only do you have those big steps, but you have little itty bitty steps you can move in between each. So you have really, really fine resolution. And this is extremely important to understand because as you move your fixture, you might be able to hit one spot. You were trying to line up on the edge of something. You can get right on either side of it, but not perfect to it. That's because you need to adjust the fine channel to get that extra little bit. It's important to understand your console and how it provides options to control your fixtures. Typically, most consoles have you controlling the coarse channel, doing those big movements as you move around, because you don't want to be dialing through 65,000 steps of moving a light. It would take a long time to move across the stage. So instead, they give you control as you're adjusting your encoder wheels or your trackballs. It gives you that coarse channel, so you have big movements to move across. But there's times you want to fine tune it. Most consoles give you an option to hold down a button or touch the screen or do something to where now you can adjust the fine channel. Whoops, before I do that, I have one more thing to say. I thought I had a bullet point. In addition, some channels let you actually adjust the full 16-bit to where you're just moving along those 65,000 steps. So you can then have super fine resolution, if you will, from moving your encoder because it's moving along completely through the 65,000 steps as opposed to moving just between the coarse or the fine. So check out your console options and see what is available to you and understand how that works, because that's going to be very important for your positioning. Different consoles have different types of hardware. Encoders are the most common that you'll find and probably the most comfortable for moving fixtures, because you have pan and tilt separately and easily to control. Some consoles allow you to have those dedicated and locked off separate from other parameters such as zoom and focus and gobo and whatnot. Other times it might change as you press different buttons between position, gobo, color, whatever you're changing, the encoders might change. But at any rate, encoders are very, very useful. Some encoders have push button abilities where you can push it down. Maybe that changes it to fine or coarse. Also, some of them have tactile feedback, where as you rotate, you can feel little notches and know where you're at certain positions. And some even make use of colored LEDs now around them or within them or underneath them that will tell you different modes of what that encoder is doing. So encoders are probably the most common method of moving your fixtures around. Now, you might also find trackballs. Trackballs were pretty common. They're out there, they're useful. They were most useful with mirror type fixtures, but you can use them for a lot of things. A lot of people like them if you're doing a live move on stage to move a fixture around. Initially, though, they were pretty jittery. They moved as you moved a trackball, the light would kind of move with your finger and be not so smooth. Luckily then some software was developed on a lot of consoles to where it would allow you to set it to pan only or tilt only, moving my hand the wrong way, tilt only or pan only, or tell it to understand that if I'm moving it mostly panning, that it can ignore any little shivering I do as I move it, so that it gets a nice smooth move and it only is looking at the pan or tilt, even though you might be slightly moving it diagonally. So trackballs are nice. Sometimes you can even connect an external trackball if you really like that. Some consoles, including the older Martin console, made use of track belts. These were pretty interesting. It's kind of like from a tank. You just kind of run your finger. It's continuous, similar to an encoder. It also could employ LEDs underneath it to give you ideas of values and all. Those can be interesting to move your fixtures. It's a different feel than rotating. You're moving your fingers up and down. Back in the early days, there were joysticks. You would think joysticks might be useful, but they're very odd, especially if it's not a mirror type fixture. It's very odd to try to operate a yoke fixture with a joystick. So that's why we don't see that very often. Another interesting thing you can do to move your fixtures around is make use of a visualizer. If you have a visualizer and you set that up to connect and talk to your console and interact directly with the console, it is possible to actually click on the screen where you want the lights to focus, and they will focus where you clicked on the visualizer. They will focus to there and send that data back to your console, that now you can store that data into your position palettes or presets. And while it might not seem like the best way to do things, sometimes it could be easier. But again, it's only as accurate as your drawing and your visualizer is to your actual rig. So you might have to update things after that. The other thing that we're seeing more often now is a new thing that ETC has called augmented. There's also some other things where people are making use of phones and tablets. You can take, it's plugged in. You can take your phone and you can actually tell it, point the lights here, and it will see where your phone is and point the lights directly to where you're standing on the stage. Now there's some setup involved in that, but it's kind of an interesting thing that you can walk up on stage and tell your lights to just point at you. It's a different type of way of doing things. So you have different hardware choices of how you will actually position your fixtures. The next thing to understand is different consoles can display the data in different methods. Some of them will display percentages, some of them will display the DMX values, and some of them will display real world values. And what that means is you might see different types of data relating to your pan and tilt. So you might see those pan and tilt values in 16-bit values that don't make much sense to you. You might see a percentage that's a percentage of its pan range. So if it says it has a pan range of 540, it might give you a percentage that you're at 50% of that pan range, and then you go above or below that. Or it might give you real world values that actually shows you and tells you you're at this degree of its 540 degrees. So depending on your console, you might be able to choose which method you like, and that's personal choice. There's also, you can set up on a lot of consoles, and it's been around for a long time actually, XYZ positioning. And XYZ is different than just having pan and tilt values. With normal pan and tilt values, you're just moving the pan or tilt of the fixtures. With XYZ, you're kind of moving them around in a known 3D space. And this typically involves some setup first. So you have to go through and set up, typically it's a position palette or preset that you define for the four corners of the stage. You define those, you give them some special marker that the console knows those are your four positions, and that will calibrate the fixtures to where it now can understand and triangulate through math where those fixtures are located in 3D. Now you can actually move the fixture positioning around in 3D space of sorts through the X, Y, and Z configurations. And that can be useful, but sometimes that can also cause problems, again, with flipping, depending on the range of your fixtures pan and tilt. And then something that's kind of developed in the last few years is more use of 3D positioning. And by 3D, I mean actual real world positioning in your console or coming from your visualizer or other external sources. So perhaps you can import into your console real position data of where your fixtures lie in a 3D space. So you import a true to life, true to scale drawing, and the console is aware of exactly how high and what position the fixtures are in. Now you can click on your console and touch where you want fixtures to go, and they will go right there. And if everything is true to the 3D world, your fixtures will actually point to where you want them to point to. And that's kind of an interesting thing. You can also define focus points that you set on the stage and move the focus point around on the stage, virtually on the screen. And guess what? Your lights will follow and move to that focus point. And you could do some cueing by moving the focus point around. Lastly, it's also possible to get real world information about automation systems. So perhaps you want to track something that's moving on the stage. You can have those values input into the console, and the console is aware of the 3D spacing of where your fixtures are. It will follow that object around the stage. Or another cool thing to do is you can have 3D positioning of the trusses and get that data from the automation system as your trusses or battens are moving around. Now you can have fixtures point directly to let's say an object on stage, and as the truss flies out, the fixtures continue to stay in that same location pointing there. They appear to do that. Of course, they're having to pan or tilt to maintain the same focus on stage while their physical position in space is moving. And that's really cool stuff. There's a lot of examples of that out there in the world you can check out, but it's really cool stuff that can be done nowadays to help with your positioning. Another nice console feature that you might want to make use of is called highlight. And it might have a different name on different consoles. Originally, it was called ID on the original Icon console. And what it does is it'll highlight the fixture that you're working on. And this is very, very useful when creating your positions, because what it'll do is it'll go to a preset, predefined setting, typically full intensity, no color, no gobo, no other effects. So it's an open white beam, and it allows you to see that beam and move it around. So it'll highlight the fixture that's currently selected. So if I select fixtures 1 through 10, they'll all be highlighted. Then I hit fixture 1, only fixture 1 is highlighted. Now I can see that to move it. Then I hit next and I'm on fixture 2. Now fixture 2 is moving around and I can move it and see it. Now I can hit next and go to fixture 3. And it's a quick, easy way for it to, as the name implies, highlight the fixture I want to move and position. You can also make use of low light. Low light is really a cool feature, because low light will allow you to tell what the other fixtures in your programmer do when you're not highlighting them. So with the example I just gave, you select fixtures 1 through 10, low light might set them all to blue if they're not currently selected. So now as I select fixture 1, it'll go to white, all the others will still be in blue. Go to fixture 2, 1 will go back to being blue, fixture 2 will be white. This allows you to see where your fixtures are going. So if you're building a big flyout, you can see that they're all together instead of just seeing one at a time. It also provides light on stage, which can be helpful if other people are working while you are building your positions. So it might look something like this as you're going through using a combination of highlight and low light. You hit next, move a fixture, hit next, move a fixture, and you can easily see which fixture you're working on, and you can see the result of where they all are. Then at the end, select all of them, and boom, you've created your position. Typically, there are highlight or low light palettes or presets that you can define to tell it what you want it to happen when you hit that button for highlight. Because you might not want it to remove all those parameters. Maybe you want to move around with the gobo in or the framing shutters in. So you might want to define that highlight palette. You also might want to go to a tight, narrow beam with the iris in so that you can really see where the light's pointing. So you might want your highlight to iris in. So it's helpful to go in and adjust highlight to be what you desire. I've even seen people who set different highlight palettes and then have macros that go in and tell the console, okay, now I'm using the one that iris is in. Now I'm using the one that takes everything to full open. And that can be a useful tool as well. When you're actually focusing, it's important to have a target to focus on. If you're actually focusing and trying to guess where down center stage is or where the guitar player is going to stand, it can be very difficult. And typically we'll do the focusing in different ways. Best way is to have people on stage. If you can have someone stand where you want them to be, you can now focus the light directly where they're going to stand. So have someone stand down center stage or in the singer's position or sit in the chair that's going to be there. Then if you have someone do that, have a technician or sometimes the lighting designer, or in the theatrical world that might hire a light walker, which is a person that's their job to stand there and be focused upon. It's great if you can have a person to focus on. If you can't, there's other things to use. Maybe there's a lectern or a podium to focus on, or if it's a band, you'll have mic stands. A lot of times people will put a white towel over the mic stand so that you can see better where those positions are. There might be specific set pieces, as I mentioned, like a chair or a podium. And one of the coolest things I ever saw was I was working on this tour that was an orchestra that toured. And of course, in the orchestra, you have 50, 60 people on stage, and occasionally certain people had solos. And we had to have positions specific to those solos and specific to each person. So the lighting designer had this great idea, and he specified on the rider that every day at 9 in the morning, they would deliver 12 or 24, I don't remember the number, let's call it 24 white helium balloons with a 6-foot string. Then the crew would go around and they had a clipboard that would tell them that each member, what their height was when they stood up, and they would cut the string and tape it down. And that each balloon would be positioned at its seat in the orchestra at the correct height for that person. Then I could go in and update the position palettes during pre-production each day and have it perfect without the orchestra member standing there waiting for me or someone else standing there. I had all those white balloons to focus on. Then they would give those balloons over at put them in the dressing rooms or put them at the meet and greet or somewhere, and they just look great there too. It was a really cool idea. Remember too that height is important. If you're focusing to mic stands and you're just moving the center of the beam to the bottom center of the mic stand, well, now that beam's not going to illuminate the person that stands there. You want to focus to the actual height of who's going to be standing there. If you know that the lead singer or the main person speaking at the lectern is 6'2" and you're not that tall, then you might want to have someone standing on stage holding their hand above their head at that height so you can make sure you're focusing it correctly where a person or people will be standing. Because the last thing you want is your positioning to be down too low. You also want to think about the fall off of the light. Where is it falling off to? And you want to think about the focus of that. Some performers don't want to have the lights focused directly in the eyes. They don't want to have the hot spot right in their eyes. So you might want to focus on their chest and let a little of the fall off go there, but put the hot spot in here. Additionally, if you have side light, maybe you don't want the side light right in the eye, so you tilt it down a little bit so they're getting not quite the hot spot of the fixture. Another important thing is think about the audience line of sight. And this is true for any type of production. When you create those great beams out in the audience and you've got beam lights or you've got gobos, whatever, that's fine if they're moving around. But if you've got, let's say, a really tight, sharp beam fixture pointing into the audience and it sits there for 4 minutes, probably somebody's not going to like that if it's shining right in their eyes. So you might want to consider, is that a good spot for that? This happens a lot also on big corporate events where you might do a big, nice look of the fixtures out over the audience like that. Well, if they're sitting there trying to read the on-screen PowerPoint slides and they're sitting there for hours on end watching people talk, people in the audience probably don't like these lights in their eyes. So what I always do is if I'm in an arena or any type of venue and I do those type of looks out in the audience or up and out over the audience, I turn around and I look and see, where are those beams hitting? Are they hitting the top row of people up in the bowl? Maybe so. So now I'm going to tilt them up a little higher so it's not right in their eyes. It's okay for a moment or two, but not for an extended amount of time. It's very bothersome for the audience to have the lights pointing right in their eyes. So always take that into consideration. If you've got to do beams down into the audience and you want to have that cool look for the full song, maybe see if you can focus them into the aisles where people aren't sitting. You'll still get that great look coming out without just blinding someone in their face for a song or for a portion of a show. And don't forget the rest of your crew. Oftentimes the monitor engineers for bands are located off the side of the stage. Maybe you do some nice side lighting, or you do beams off the side, and you might be hitting them right in the face. Maybe you're doing a theatrical presentation and you've got lights that falling off to the sides. It's right in the stage manager's eyes. Always remember that as well, because when you're positioning, you've got to think not only how does it look for the show's sake, but how is it affecting the audience and the crew as well. Another helpful tool, Benny spoke about this as well, is to create a reference position. Let's say you've put up your rig, you're on a touring production, and you tell all the fixtures to go to the drum focus, and it looks like that picture there on the top. That's not very good. You're going to spend a lot of time updating the position. Well, perhaps if those truss towers are just positioned incorrectly, maybe they're not perfectly straight position, maybe they're angled. Maybe you can just ask the crew to angle it back to the correct orientation, and guess what? All your positions are correct. This is especially true with floor type fixtures. They get kicked, they get positioned slightly angled differently than perfectly straight out to the stage. Sometimes it's easier to have a reference position, as you see on the bottom there, where you know all your lights are pointing to something. Then you can literally go around and move the fixture itself, tweak the fixture itself to that, and that will save you having to update 40, 80, who knows how many positions by just getting it oriented correctly on stage or in the rig, or check the trim height, or whatever it is you need to do. It's great if you can have a position that you know what it looks like, where the lights should be hitting, and you can just look at that quickly and maybe tweak the rig itself instead of tweaking all of your actual values in your console. Another thing that is common on a lot of shows that can happen is you might end up flying blind. Now, this picture here you see is a common thing when people are learning to fly. They have to put blinders on and only fly the airplane by looking at their controls. They're not allowed to look out the window. And that's a pretty big test for them. But that happens to us as programmers quite often. You might be in a situation where you can't actually see what you're programming. Maybe it's because it's a architectural event and you're located in some other area, or maybe it's because the fixtures are just in an area that it's hard for you to see, or they're who knows what. But if it's you can't see from your place, how are you gonna move that? How are you gonna work with those fixtures? So you've got to think about that. The other thing is, if your front of house is not perfectly center, that could be a problem if you're creating these looks that are trying to look symmetrical or focused to center. If you're way over on the far right side of the auditorium, then your viewing is going to be skewed. So you might want to see that from a better angle. So how do you make sure that you can see and not fly blind? Well, one way is to actually move front of house around. Take your console, put it on wheels on top of a road case, and move it to a better position for programming, and then move it back where you need to for your for actual playback. I did that with a corporate event recently where I couldn't see because we were relegated to the back right corner of the venue. So what I did is, for pre-programming, I moved my console to the very center of the room and sat there. I moved some chairs out of the way, and I did all my positions. Then I moved myself back into the corner to actually operate and run the show. So that's one way, is to move your front of house around. Another way is to make use of remotes. Back in the Whole Hog 2 days, there was actually a remote that had a wheel on it that you could move around, but it required a cable and you had to connect the cable. Nowadays, you can use a tablet or you can use your phone, and these are very, very useful. You can move all around a venue. You can walk up on stage. Sometimes you can even just move the phone to do pan and tilt values if you wish. But again, it's very useful if you can get up and move away from your console and see the stage the way the audience will see it or the cameras will see it. Then you can position properly. And then lastly, if you have to, you can resort to radios or phones. And this is where you get someone else to be your eyes. So maybe you're sitting at your console programming and you have someone tell you, oh, you need to pan that to the right. And that's where you grab your wheel and you move it and they say, no, 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 the other right or the other left, because it's always inevitably the wrong way when you're not looking at it. So you're just sitting at your console taking commands from beyond over the phone or the radio. And that happens quite often as well. And another good thing, if you're doing that, working with someone else, that's a really good time to make use of the highlight feature, because then they can see exactly which fixture you have selected in the moment and that you're working with. Otherwise, it's very confusing to know which fixture you're currently working with. So make use of highlight when you're doing that as well. And then the other thing is you probably want to do some documentation. You want to document your work and document your positions beyond just the labels in the console. And there's all different ways to do this. You could do it through descriptions. You could do it through pictures, through things, take screenshots of your visualizer of the real world, whatever it is you need to do, put that together. It helps when you need to rebuild the show. It helps if you have to hand the show over to someone else to operate it. Documentation is a good thing. So you could do spreadsheets, as you see here, all different types of methods of documentation. Some consoles will even allow you to do exports. So from your console, you can export information about all your position palettes or presets. It could be as an XML or PDF file. It could include all the data, or it might just be the names, whatever. It depends on the options of your desk. The other thing is there's some really cool different software applications out there. Two of them that are very common are called Focus Track or Moving Light Assistant. And these are designed to work with specific consoles and other devices. So you can connect a camera, connect the console, and connect the software all together. And you can literally go through your positions and tell it, store this, and it'll take a picture. It'll identify where fixtures are. It'll give you all the data. They do some really, really cool things that help you keep track of how the lights are used in your shows. And these are wonderful productions, or wonderful tools that are used on a lot of productions, typically theatrical more than anything, but a great way to really document what's going on with all of your positioning and other data. All right, so now we've come to the third and last part of the presentation here. We're going to talk about some common positions. Now, these are positions you can make use of on pretty much every show. Doesn't mean you will on all of them, but you might find it useful to think of these types of positions. These are things I commonly use on pretty much every show I do. I think about, I need these types of positions. Again, it'll vary. Throughout this part, I'm going to be looking at showing you examples through a visualizer here with 8 quantum spots in this upstage position. Of course, it'll vary a little bit depending if you have front light or side light or floor light. But for simplicity, we're just going to look at it using these 8 upstage quantum spots. So first of all, downstage edge. I spoke of this earlier, how much I really like a downstage edge. It's a really great starting point. I set that as my default. It helps me know where I'm moving my fixtures, helps me avoid flips, but it's also useful in productions. You can make use of a downstage edge position for many different things. You can set it for beams looking out in the audience. It's common for a nice wash. People always stand on the downstage edge, no matter what type of show, they line up there. So it's really handy to use a downstage edge type position. Another thing that everyone likes to use are fanouts. And consoles have different methods to help you create these. It's a mathematical function typically called fan or align, or it might have some other names, that will spread your fixtures apart in a mathematical manner. And you can select different types of fanning or aligning. You can select it to go from center or go from one end or the other. You can even group things in and have groups of 3 fans and 3 fans and 3 fans and spread that across your fixtures. And these always look wonderful when you have beams in the air or even just for create looks on the stage. It's a great way to quickly spread and cover an area. Fanning is a really cool tool, and you can create a lot of really wonderful, nice looking symmetrical looks by making use of fan or align or spread type tools. Stage wash is almost always important as well because people are all over the stage and you need to cover it pretty nicely. And you want to make sure the stage wash is nice and even, doesn't have too many hot spots or any dark spots. You want to make sure as people move across the stage that they're perfectly evenly lit all the way across. And there's all different methods to doing that. It might be straight focuses, might be cross focuses, might be pools of light that slightly overlap. Different people have different ideas and different methods of how they like to do that. But stage washes are important. Of course, a lot of theatrical and dance type productions will make use of different stage washes. Even in concerts and corporate events, it's important to have a stage wash because people are always all over the stage. And it can be handy when somebody steps out of their spot or out of an area that you didn't expect. You bring up that stage wash and you've got them covered. It's always a good get out of jail thing as well. Another common thing you might want to set focuses and prepare focuses for are set pieces. Now, I didn't have a very exciting set here in my model, but you see all those squares up there on the backdrop. But there might be set pieces that you need to create positions for. And in this case, this is one of the spots you might want to store in addition to the pan and tilt position. You might want to store the zoom and or framing shutters with specific to those set positions because typically the set will be the set as it is, and you might have to put the fixtures up there and you want them to be aligned with those different pieces in the same way every time. So set pieces are common positions you might be creating as well. And then there's specials. In the theatrical world, in television, there's always specials. There's somebody sitting in that chair, or maybe it's an acting area upstage right, or maybe it's a special platform. In the touring and concert world, it might be the different band members, as I've mentioned, the drummer and the guitar and the lead singer. It might be different pools of light specific to a dance number. Specials are always unique, and they may contain all your fixtures or only certain fixtures. They're unique to that production, and just something, as the name implies, that's special. Another thing a lot of people like to create are what I call crisscross type focuses. And these are very handy in creating very geometric shapes. They look really nice on concert type productions, great in corporate events and things, because they are so symmetrical and eye pleasing. Also, if you create a crisscross and you go this way, then you create one going the opposite way. Now you can create chases that go between these two crisscross focuses. Those sometimes look pretty nice for certain songs and things. So you'll see crisscross focuses used quite a lot. And you can intersperse and combine, maybe put the odd fixtures in one crisscross focus and the even in the other crisscross focus, and then all your lights are pointing one way versus crisscrossing each other. There's a lot of different things you can do if you start from crisscross type positions. And that's another thing. Sometimes it's nice to have positions that you use just as starting points for other effects. So I will do a random stage position. And a random stage position is nice because it breaks up that symmetrical look, and you can cover a stage but with some non-symmetrical beams around. But it's also a great place to start an effect, to start a ballyhoo type effect that moves around the stage. Start them randomly as opposed to in a more symmetrical look. Or if you want to do kickouts or flyouts from the stage, start them from this random position. Again, that doesn't look so symmetrical, it breaks it up, makes it look different. Additionally, it just looks nice. It's nice on the stage to have fixtures hitting the stage in a random type methodology. You do need to be careful to make sure you're covering most of the stage when you set up your random stage position. And another favorite of everyone are aerial type focuses, and these are plentiful. When you have haze in the air and you're seeing beams of light coming out at you, you can do all different types of things. You can do up over the audience. You can make really nice, interesting patterns in the air. You can make lots of different looks with these aerial type focuses, depending on your fixtures and the haze. And you might want to use that fanning and aligning. You might want to use crisscross, random, all different types of aerial type focuses to really create those geometrics in the air. Another common position for a lot of shows are blinders. This is where you actually point the light straight out into the audience's eyes and you're blinding them. And you might think that's really just for concerts, but it's not. It can be useful in other types of productions. It could be useful in theatrical to create scene change type things. That's how they used to do scene changes, actually, was blind the audience for a moment. You could also use it in something that's an outdoor type production to give some look that the audience can see when you're trying to compete with the sun. You can also, of course, use it for big dramatic moments in concerts, but blinders are very, very useful. Now, remember, when you create a blinder focus, try to think of yourself and the crew. Maybe if you're blinding out in the audience, maybe you pan a few over out of the way so it's not your eyes or the sound engineer's eyes, or particularly the LD sitting next to you in their eyes, or the director. So keep the blinder out of front of house if you can. Keep it just blinding the audience or the cameras if you're doing a televised event and that's part of the look. Audience focuses are always important. You might want to illuminate the audience for different reasons. If you're doing a televised event, of course, you're going to need to see the audience. If you're doing certain types of clubs or different things where the audience wants to be part of the action and be in the light, then you're going to need to illuminate it. And you might even have a band that wants to see their audience. They want the audience lit so that they can see them. So you might have to create positions that are in the audience. And what I suggest is take the time to really look at that and hone that, and don't light things that are not the audience. Don't light the empty aisles. Don't have lights illuminating these aisles or the VOMs where people enter and exit. Instead, make sure you're actually lighting where people are sitting. I was on a tour where it was really important that the band sees the audience, but they didn't want to know when the venue was not fully sold out. So we actually had to get the seating chart every day from the venue. Let's see where seats were sold or not sold, and then illuminate and update our lens or our audience focus so that only the actual audience was illuminated, not empty seating areas. And that's also important, of course, for televised shows as well. You don't want to be illuminating big empty banks of audience. You want to only illuminate where there are people in the audience. And just like on the stage, it's nice to have a random audience focus. Again, something that's not so symmetrical, something that's hitting everywhere. It's a great place to start your ballyhoos. It also looks really nice and crazy. But again, if you're going to keep it static, think about where the lights are hitting so they're not just blinding people in their eyes for an extended amount of time. And then lastly, you might also want to consider some utility type of positions. And these are things that might be useful, such as a work light type position, illuminating the stairs as I showed there, so that people could see the steps. You might want to do a lamp check where lights are pointing at a wall so you can see that the lamps are all active and good. There's a lot of different things you might want. You might also want a 50-50. If you do like I do, or I've suggested, have that default position downstage, then you're going to want to store a position that's the 50-50 that points your lights back to that straight down position. You might also, one of the ones I like to do is if there's fixtures I have that are maybe up and over my head or somewhere, I'll actually create a small front of house focus. And I find that useful to where, let's say I drop something on the floor at front of house, or the director or someone who's sitting in front of house needs to see suddenly because they dropped something or their little light went out and they say, hey, I need some light over here. I can just quickly grab a light, hit the front of house position, and boom, I've now illuminated that work area that I know is helpful to me and hopefully to others as well. So you might want to have a few utilities. Another utility thing to think about is emergency positions. Maybe you need to have, hopefully you have an emergency queue that you can go to. But in addition to that, you might need positions that illuminate exits or illuminate walkways for people. So you might also think about emergency positions as utility positions. All right, so hopefully now you understand a lot about positioning. It's been a fun time explaining this to you. And I have one more thing to remember when it comes to positioning and programming in general. Always have fun. I mean, we get to play with these cool little robots that illuminate light, and we get to illuminate stages and create big beams and things. So remember to always have fun with your positioning, but take the time to make sure your positions are correct and accurate and your consoles are configured. So that comes to the end of my presentation. I thank you for listening, and hopefully you'll take something away and improve your positioning. If you'd like to reach out to me, I have my information here on the screen. You can send me an email or check out my website. And I see some people have asked some questions, and please, I'm open to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Brad. So let me avoid the flip, always tilt first. It's about the resolution. I love the balloon tree in the orchestra. So thank you, Brad. That was a great discussion. All right, so now we have time for Q&A with Brad. Remember, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. All right, so looks like our first question, Brad, is when doing an old school focus grid, what are your tips for avoiding flips? You may have covered this, but if you could maybe cover this one again for us.
Yeah, again, flips, it's helpful if you can tilt first. That's the first thing. And start from the same position, hopefully not a 50-50. If you've created a down center stage or downstage position or the middle of that focus grid, start there for all of your positions. Don't always start from that 50-50. That's the best way.
Great. All right, Brad. Also, this is going back to earlier in the presentation. There was a question that came in that said it was on your palettes and presets slide, and it said on one of the presets you had a button that said, "What does the band nested refer to?" With nested in parentheses. Band's obvious, but what did nested mean for you in that one?
Probably well, I was based on the word too because you said nested. Um, embedded presets or palettes. That's the word I think that you're referring to there. And embedded again is when you have a palette or preset that instead of having fixture data in it, it actually refers to other palettes or presets. So you might have the three band member or four band member positions stored in one palette that's called stage wash, but instead of just being raw pan and tilt values, that stage wash palette references those other palettes. It's a little confusing, but I think you get it.
That made a lot clearer for me. Okay, so also we had a comment. Thanks for a great webinar. Two questions about hardware. One, could you recommend any good trackballs? And two, what would you guess will be the next generation of hardware for consoles, I guess, for touchpad, kinetic, that kind of thing?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't really have a recommendation on a trackball because I typically don't use a trackball. I prefer to use the encoders. I find trackballs not that exciting. Again, mainly I would use a trackball for positioning if I'm doing like a live move myself on stage, but otherwise I prefer when I'm building positions and all to use the encoders. As far as the future of things, um, I really like where ETC is going with having your phone and saying focus here. You could have someone else on stage go up and hit that and it'll come to you. I think that's a cool technology. I think there's some other things we've looked at. I've seen toyed around from different manufacturers of using gloves and virtual reality type things or heads up displays to, you can point and with looking through a clear monitor or a heads up display, you can point where you want a light and it'll go there. I think a lot of things like that might come to fruition in the next couple of years, but they're going to be novelties for a while. It's going to be a while before we get rid of those good old encoders that are easy to grab.
All right. Also, we had a question. Do you have an idea or an average of how long to position, say, 10 lights or 100 lights and so on?
Yeah, that's a good question. That depends on the person, and it depends on. Well, I guess we're talking about starting from scratch.
Looks like it.
I've never really thought about the amount of time. If you've already got it laid out and you have an idea of where you're going, as I mentioned, doing it ahead of time on an offline editor, putting them in, that's the first step to save yourself some time. Because if you have to think about them when you first sit down with the rig in a venue, that's going to take a little longer and you have to do all the labeling. So get that done ahead of time. Then that'll give you the guideline of, okay, I know I have to build these 20 positions or 40 positions. That might take you an hour, depending on how many fixtures you have and how exacting you are. And again, you have to remember there's always other things going on as well that get in your way, because you have to find a time when the house lights are off and when it's dark and when it's useful for you to work and other people are not making use of the stage. But overall, yeah, you probably need at least an hour to sit down and start setting your positions, no matter what size rig you have. And it can also be useful, just rough them in, get them close, and then find time later to get them perfect. Sometimes I've done shows where I've roughed them all in as best I can while they're still building the rig, and I just do the upstage truss because they haven't built the downstage truss yet. I rough those in, then they do the downs, and I build it, and as I can, you do what you can. Make use of your time the best you can is all I can really say.
Perfect. Okay, what about for the downstage edge, do you use the min, the max, or medium zoom?
I typically use the medium zoom unless I know the venue requires something different. So if I know I have a real high trim height or real low trim height, and I know I'm always going to be in the full wide or full narrow, then I would default my fixtures to either end of that. But typically for most shows, I'll keep it at the 50% zoom, unless I know it's going to be always the opposite.
Okay. Next one is there a console or consoles that you've seen that would be good for houses of worship when introducing the novice to moving lights? The novice programmer, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's nothing specific to a house of worship versus other type of show. I think all consoles nowadays are pretty much operate the same way. There was a time that one particular console had a good run through the house of worship market, and kind of got known for that. I don't really want to say that they are a house of worship console. They wish to do more, so I'm not going to name that console. But overall, they all do the same thing and work the same way. So it comes down to how the console is set up and who programs it, to how easy it would be for a volunteer to come in and take over.
Okay, we've got another one that came in that says, when dealing with LED lamp MH fixtures and 5R SR lamp fixtures, any hint as to how to make them look even for intensity?
Yeah, I think I understand what they're asking there. Obviously, you can dim down the intensity, but that sometimes will change the quality of the beams. I'm not real sure how to answer that in this moment. Another thing you can look at is adjusting the color temperature. Oftentimes, your really narrow 5R type fixtures are a real high color temperature, so that will make them look not as bright if you can bring down their color temperature. And you can also consider the angle of incidence, which is the angle of which the fixtures are presenting. They'll look brighter at an angle towards the audience versus pointing straight down. It really depends what you're doing. That's a tough question to answer this simply.
Sure. Brad, how do you manage updating positions while a show is running?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because it depends on how busy you are during the show. If I'm doing a corporate event and some speaker walks up to the lectern there and grabs it and kind of moves it over a foot, well, now I need to update that. So I'm going to grab my fixtures that are for the podium or the lectern, and I'm going to slowly move them over live. So I've moved them all over to that new position. Now I need to update that and store that as the new podium or lectern position. Luckily, most consoles have a feature called auto update, where you can hit one button, update, and it'll pop up and tell you, hey, these lights that you've moved, they are stored in this position, the podium position or the down center stage position. And it'll ask you, do you want to update this cue that you're in, or do you want to update the palette or preset? And it's important you understand, if you update just the cue, it'll put those raw values in the cue as opposed to updating the palette or preset. And then when you get to the next cue that has the podium, they're going to be back in that old position. So you pretty much always want to update that palette or preset so that you're correct from there. Now, if you're in a show where you're very busy with lots of cues and lots of things and you're busy operating and maybe calling follow spots, then you might want to have a technician or a front of house tech or someone else kind of watching and doing those updates for you while you're running the show. Just depends on what you're doing. But either way, the auto update feature in consoles is extremely useful.
Okay. Can position palettes or presets be merged from show to show?
Yes, if you've got similar type fixtures, you can merge the data. It doesn't mean that it's going to apply from one show to another if the rig is different. But you can do that, and then you can update those cues, update those palettes or presets with the new data that is appropriate for that show. Now, it's just going to depend on your console. Some consoles don't allow for individual merging of cue data or palettes or presets, and others do. So you need to take a look at what your console is capable of. But it is possible to merge them, and that is a good way to import those common ones that you build all the time, and then just update them accordingly for each show as needed.
All right. How do you position fixtures during the day for an outdoor concert?
Yeah, the sun is a big enemy of trying to update positions during the day. It can be very difficult if you're doing an outdoor festival or concert or something, and the sun is blasting in on the stage, and they say, okay, we built the rig, you've got an hour, update your positions. You can't see. It's very difficult. A couple of different things you can use. Again, put something on the stage that you can illuminate. That will help a little bit, but that doesn't help with the sun. What's best is to have someone up on stage, standing there with their radio or their phone, calling to you and telling you, move it a little more to the right, a little more to the left, up, down, helping you get those positions dialed in as they're looking at the light coming into their eyes. That's usually the best method of doing that. I've seen people also take their remote up on stage and do that themselves, focus the light in their eyes. That can be difficult though, because you're looking at the light and the sun coming into you, and then you're trying to look at your remote it is very tough sometimes on your own eyes to do that. And another way is to have the console up on the stage and move the console around as well, but that gets a little bulky and in the way of people. The last method I've used, sometimes it helps, is with binoculars to try to zoom in and see, but that depends on the level of sunlight. That doesn't always help.
Okay. Next one is, do you store all your fixtures into every position palette?
Yeah. Uh, Initially, I do, and I used to always, but shows used to be a lot smaller. Now we have shows with 2, 3, 400 fixtures. And if you have fixtures that you know are dedicated to be lighting the audience or lighting, doing up and out type stuff over the audience, doing your beamage, you probably don't need to store those in your stage watch positions or the drummer position. If you know they're absolutely never going to be used there, there's really no need to store them in those positions. It's just going to be extra data, and it's going to be confusing as to why that position for the drum has the lights that are never going to go there focused on it. And it's a waste of time to do that. But other shows, yeah, you might want to focus all your fixtures that can hit the stage in all those stage positions, because maybe you don't know what the LD is going to ask for. And the LD might say, hey, I really want that watch light over there pointing in the upstage right for this one scene. And if you didn't already have that in that position, now you're going to have to take the time to manually move it to that position.
All right, here's a good one. What happens to your cues if you delete a preset?
Yes, when you delete a preset, it depends on your desk. Different desks handle it different ways. But typically what they'll do, if you delete a preset, let's say I had that center stage position, I delete it, most consoles will, throughout the cues, wherever it was referenced, will just change that reference back to the raw data. So the pan and tilt values will be inserted into the cues instead of the palette reference that was there. However, some consoles might just delete it completely from the show. So it depends on your console. So you need to be careful when you're deleting palettes. One good practice that I do when there's a palette you don't want to have on your show anymore is two things. One, you can bury it. Go into where your palettes are stored, go move all the way down to the bottom of that window. Maybe it's number 2000, 9000, who knows, and call it the dead zone and store those down there. And maybe make a little note on the label, not used anymore. That way, if you did accidentally still have it in use, you would know. And it would still be buried, but not deleted, causing a problem to your show. The other thing is some consoles will allow you to view a report of what palettes or presets are used and how often and in which cues. So you could do that. And if it says 0, then you could feel safe knowing, hey, I built this one and it's never been used, so I can just delete it and I don't need it anymore.
All right. Well, Brad, that looks like that was our last question to come in. So perfect timing to wrap up.
Super.
Thanks so much, Brad, for presenting this really insightful webinar. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
Again,
you,
as I mentioned in the beginning,
Oh, sorry,
You're welcome, Brad. Thank you.
To everyone who joined, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So go ahead, Lane, wrap it up.
All right. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we will have this presentation out as a recording on our channels in just a few days. If you'd like to go back and watch it again or share with a colleague. We also do have several upcoming sessions, so you can check out and register for those on our learning sessions section of our website at pro.harman.com. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.